Well, good Monday, and thank you for being here for our Monday Bible study, whether you're here in person or online. We are so glad that you're here. Today we will be looking at our sermon text from yesterday, but looking in it in a larger framework in the book of Genesis. So I've asked everybody here and online, if you'd like to turn over to Genesis chapter 4. So the story we read yesterday in worship and talked about was the story of Joseph and his brothers. And it is a story of jealousy and favoritism and ego and a desire to murder, selling into slavery, and then all the other stuff that happens afterwards. So to put this in context of Genesis, it is good to know all of the story of Genesis. And we know that in Genesis 1, for example, in the first creation story, God creates a world that is good. And then when we get to Genesis chapter 2 and following, we get another creation story where God is still creating good, but because of human interaction in this world, sin and evil seems to creep up in it. Yet God is still working in the world for good, even when there's what? Sin. And let's look at the first story of brothers. So when Genesis tells this first story of brothers, we put it in context of thinking about Genesis, and Genesis 1 offers this beautiful portrait of the world outside. And you look outside and it's orderly, there's night and day, there are seasons, everything seems to have a place and everything fits the way it's supposed to. And then you look inside the home and we get to Genesis 2 and 3, and the question becomes, it's so orderly out there, but inside the house, it seems very disordered sometimes. And part of the disorder is, why don't we get along all the time? Why are there all of these things that happen that make life, that ordered reality out there, chaotic in here? And part of Genesis is trying to understand and unpack theologically why this is. And then we get to the story of brothers, and all of us are a part of families. How many of you have siblings? How many of you always get along with your siblings? How many of you have children? How many of your children always get along with each other? No. You know, some of the more popular shows or television shows are about families, and most of them have conflicts. You know, some of the most popular shows on TV today, I don't watch it, but I've heard about it. Yellowstone. It sounds like Dynasty, just in a different form. You know, the kind of things we know is that, you know, families, because of either wanting to be the favorite or not feeling like they're as loved, whether it's money involved, there's always what? There's conflict. And there's not one family that gets by without it. Now, there are some that work a lot better, and there are some that work a lot less. So the first family, Adam and Eve, have 2 children. Chapter 4 of Genesis. Now the man knew his wife Eve, and she conceived and bore Cain, saying, I have produced a man with the help of the Lord. Next, she bore his brother Abel. Now Abel was a keeper of sheep, and Cain a tiller of the ground. So you've got one who is a shepherd, and you've got one who is a farmer. And they essentially take kind of the main professions of what most Israelites would eventually do. You got shepherds and farmers, livestock and produce. In the course of time, Cain brought to the Lord an offering of the fruit of the ground. And Abel, for his part, brought the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions. And the Lord had regarded for Abel his offering, but for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So what's interesting about chapter 4 of Genesis is after Adam and Eve conceive Cain and Abel, they don't appear within the narrative of the story of Cain and Abel. In many ways, God becomes the parent of the two. He's the fill-in for Father. And notice what happens. In worship, that's what they're doing, sacrificing to Yahweh, the Lord. And we don't see that within any of the text that one is doing anything better than the other. But throughout the book of Genesis, we'll find that the younger son, even though he's the younger, and in the tradition of the Hebrew people, the older is always favored, it always is kind of the reverse here. And for some reason, the Lord favors Abel over Cain. Now, how many of y'all have families, whether it's children or you're part of sibling groups, that either you're the youngest or how many of y'all are the youngest? Were y'all babied a little more? Spoiled a little more? Favored a little more? Yesterday I asked my Sunday school class this, and most of them were the older ones and said, yeah. You know, I mean, I've got a twin brother, but I've got an older sister. And fortunately or unfortunately, you know, she got to grow up and make mistakes ahead of us so that when we got older, it didn't seem as life or death situation. I mean, you know, the treatment was different from the first to the last. So here we have this situation where the Lord's the one, for one reason or another. We're not told Cain's done anything bad. And Cain, because of this, Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. Imagine just being in a family group where one is favored over the other. No matter how hard you work, no matter what you do, what happens? You feel a little what? Diminished. Now the problem is what are you going to do with it? And that becomes part of the story here. So the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? And why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. So here we're given a little bit of input into Cain a little more. But Cain's worked hard. He's got his offering. Abel's done the same thing. God sees more for Abel than he does for Cain. Cain feels bad about it. And God comes to him and says, listen, if you do well, will you not be accepted? We have to ask the question, well, what didn't he do well? Is this past tense, present tense, future tense? But if you do not do well, and I think this is part of the wellness part here, is his relationship with God and his brother. If you do well in this relationship, you will do well. But if you do not do well, sin is lurking at the door. So this is poetic language here. Just imagine you're in a place where you're upset and you're angry. And you get ready to walk out into the world, and right outside the door is lurking for you something that's going to what? Take you over. It desires you. It wants to master you. So God warns Cain, if you can't control these emotions, if you can't control these feelings, then sin, the resistance to God's will to do well, can take control of you. You give it over to come and to let it do its will. So God has warned Cain in his relationship with him and with his brother to do well. What does Cain do? We don't know exactly when and how long, but Cain said to his brother Abel, let us go out into the field. That's his domain, the field. And when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. So if you want to know what sin happens when sin takes mastery, life that God has given, someone else takes away. Not only someone, but his brother. The Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" He said, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" You think about kind of the arrogance of that answer. It's kind of, I've mentioned this before, but y'all have watched enough TV, Datelines or 60 Minutes or something like that. The person that's done the bad thing gets questioned, and what do? Yeah, they deny it or they throw it off. I don't know what you're talking about. I mean, this is the first interrogation scene we have. Where's your brother? I don't know. Am I responsible for his comings and goings? I don't keep track of everything he does. And the Lord said, "What have you done?" Notice how Cain is constantly not taking responsibility for his action. And what does God say? "Listen, your brother's blood is crying out from the ground." So the first story we have of brothers is a story of murder. And throughout the rest of the narrative of Genesis, when we pick up with family stories in Genesis 12 and following, the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, it is stories of brothers at odds. And the question will become, God has chosen Abraham and Sarah to be parents of a great nation. What happens if the parents' children kill each other and stop God's future from being accomplished? What if the sin of Cain and Abel continues in this story? So we get the story of Isaac and Ishmael, and Abraham, who has been told he will have a son, doesn't conceive. Sarah, in her attempt to try to make things better, allows him to sleep with her handmaiden, Hagar, and they have Ishmael. And as soon as she has Ishmael, Sarah hates. She's jealous. It becomes a system of the older child here, even though he's not done anything wrong, just because of his status as not being their child. And then Isaac's eventually born, and what does Abraham do? He has to send him away. And then Isaac finally gets married. That's a different story. He's reluctant to do it to begin with. He doesn't seem to have any initiative to carry on God's future that God has promised. Abraham essentially has to go find him a wife. And he takes her back to his mother's tent. He was a mama's boy. There's a whole other issues within the narrative. Finally has twins. And we talked a little bit about Jacob and Esau last week. But the story with those two brothers is that one brother is trying to get what's not his from the other. That doesn't happen in families, does it? Well, that never happens. Well, we see within God's chosen family that is supposed to be the family that is supposed to be a great nation, that is supposed to be a light to the world, to bring people to Yahweh, to God, that God chooses families that look a whole lot like ours. Anytime you read and you think about the patriarchs and their families, just imagine your family being in the mix. Yeah, Abraham had faith where he followed, but he still was not the best father or husband. And these brothers were at odds. And there's a scene when we talked about last week where Jacob and Esau are going to meet, and the question is going to be, what's going to happen? Can they forgive and forget and move on, or will they fight each other? We talked about how Jacob had a new name given and a new reality. So those brothers let the story continue. And then Jacob, who we learned earlier in the narrative, falls in love with the woman of his dreams. And he's tricked. Marries the woman's sister. And we know very early on within that story, he does not have the same affection for Leah as he does Rachel, does he? And she struggles with that. She continues to bear children for him, and yet he still loves the other sister. Another sibling rivalry story. Finally, he has a son from Rachel, Joseph. Now think about this. This is the woman you love the most. You've got other children, but he looks like his mama. He's the favorite. And Jacob, Israel, doesn't hide how much he loves his son. He gives him special treatment and preference. Now imagine you grow up knowing that you are the favorite. Do you keep that to yourself? Your ego from an early age, what? Gets big. Does anybody know anybody like that? We all know people like that. Sometimes it's the only child. Lily would probably be one of those. But here, I mean, he's got all of these older brothers who are out working and working hard for their father. And little Joseph gets a coat. A beautiful coat. Not only that, he is told to go and check on his brothers. And we can only imagine little Joseph having the habit of tattletelling. And then he starts having dreams. There's nothing wrong with his dreams other than the way he shares them. He has two dreams, and in both of them, representations of grain and stars representing him as better and his brothers as subservient to him. And he shares those. Now you can imagine the brothers talking together and their frustration with what? Little Joseph. It goes from being an annoyance to anger to resentment to hate. And that's how it works in family life sometimes too, doesn't it? From annoyance to resentment to anger to hate. Y'all know families that are no longer talking to each other? Estrangement. Well, one day, Daddy tells little Joseph, I want you to go check on your brothers. We know what that means. Go see if they're at work or not. If they're doing what they're supposed to do. So we read the story yesterday. If you've got your Bible, let's turn over to Genesis. Let's see. 37. 37. Now Joseph's brothers went to pasture their father's flock near Shechem. And Israel said to Joseph, "Are not your brothers pasturing in the flock of Shechem? Come, I will send you to them." And he answered, "Here I am." So he said to him, "Go now and see if it is well with your brothers and with the flock, and bring back word to me." So we don't know the motivation here, but y'all have been around families. Listen, Joseph, they are supposed to be in Shechem. Yeah. He's got an idea they're not. I want you to go and see if they're there, and if everything's good, and if not, or if it is, just come back and tell me. Now, Joseph was given an order, what? Just to go to Shechem and come back. He came to Shechem and found a man wandering in the fields and asked him, "What are you seeking?" "I am seeking my brothers. Tell me, please, where are they pasturing the flock?" And the man said to him, "They have gone away, for I heard them say, 'Let us go to Dothan.'" So all Joseph really had to do was go home. Go tell his dad. Now here's the thing about Joseph. Joseph is so unaware of how his brothers see him and feel about him that he willingly goes to Dothan. He willingly tells them his stories of his dreams. He's oblivious. Y'all know anybody like that? I mean, within the story, nobody is necessarily without some blame. I mean, Jacob has created this little Frankenstein son that is oblivious to other people's feelings of how they feel about him and about his favoritism. And the brothers are guilty of not expressing this with anybody. And the father's guilty of just being unaware of how he makes his other family feel. And that's usually how it works in families. You know, not until something bad really happens do people realize, hey, maybe it's not them, maybe it's been me too. You know, it's family systems. So Joseph went after his brothers and found them at Dothan, and they saw him from a distance, and before he came near to them, they conspired to kill him. Because we can imagine them being kind of up top of a hill and seeing him down the hill. And how do they recognize him probably? With his pretty little coat. And you can just feel them going, "Oh, he's coming. What are we going to do? Let's just kill him." And you can hear somebody say it kind of as a joke. And somebody else, "That's not a bad idea." Well, how are we going to do it? Well, let's talk about that for a second here. So they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes this dreamer." They've identified him by what he identifies himself. "Come now, let us kill him and throw him in one of the pits. Then they will say that a wild animal has devoured him, and we shall see what will become of his dreams. Let's throw him into a pit, and he'll be down there, and something wild will come down there and get him. And we'll see all those dreams about him being in charge of us. We'll see how that turns out." But when Reuben heard it, he delivered him out of their hand, saying, "Let us not take his life." Now notice what Reuben does and doesn't do. Reuben says, "Let's not take his life. Let's just throw him into the pit. Shed no blood, throw him into this pit here in the wilderness, but do not lay a hand on him, that he might rescue him out of their hand and restore him to his father." So his idea is, I'm going to trick them in not killing him. They'll throw him into the pit. When they leave, I'm going to go somewhere. When they leave, I'm going to come back and take him back home. So Reuben comes up with this plan, but just notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't stop them. Sometimes family systems, it's hard to do the right thing. We think we know what the right thing is, but standing up against his brother's will is hard. What if they throw me in the pit? So when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the long robe with sleeves that he wore, and they took him and they threw him into a pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. So we can imagine this as something like a well, but it's a pit that they would have dug to have water, maybe a little bit of irrigation. But it's a big enough pit that when you fall in, you don't crawl out. Not on your own. But just imagine little Joseph's walking up, sees his brothers, got a big smile on his face. Daddy's going to be so excited to hear where your fellers are. He's oblivious. I mean, if you knew these guys hated you that much, why would you just show up in the middle of nowhere? He doesn't realize. He shows up, and you can just imagine his shock and his horror as they grab hold of him and rip his coat off. And you can imagine within the narrative of the story, we're not told the inward thoughts of any of these characters, but we can imagine their excitement at this prospect, and his fear and his bewilderment and his confusion. You think about when somebody does something to you and you ask the question, why? And you can imagine him asking that question out loud and them thinking or saying, you should know. And then they throw him naked into a pit. That pit represents for us death. You can imagine the question, why would my brothers do this? You can imagine his fear and his anxiety. You can imagine deep down he's asking all those hard questions. The pit was empty, there was no water in it. They sat down to eat. So you're alone in a dark pit hearing your brothers talking and eating lunch. I mean, there's no remorse there. They didn't have the decency to go across the field and eat. They ate there. And as they're eating, they look up and saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, with their camels carrying gum, balm, and resin on their way to carry it down to Egypt. Then Judah said to his brothers, what profit is it if we kill our brother and conceal his blood? He sees an opportunity. This isn't, I've got pity on my brother and I don't want to kill him. He sees the opportunity to make some money off of his brother's life. There's nothing noble about what he says or does. Come, let us sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him, for he is our brother, our own flesh. Now listen what he says, but what he's doing. We shouldn't really kill him, he's our own flesh. He's convincing himself and his brothers that this is a right way of doing things. Just a minute ago, they're ready to kill him. And his brothers agreed, and when some Midianite traders passed by, they drew Joseph up, lifting him out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 pieces of silver. And they took Joseph to Egypt. So imagine Joseph waking up one morning at home with his dad, going off to go see his brothers. And by the end of the day, he's been stripped of his clothes, thrown into a pit, and sold to slavery. By his brothers. Not some random strangers, not some robbers on the road, his own brothers. Can you just imagine the state of shock that Joseph's in? You've met people that have had something bad happen to them. They're in shock. It's not even registered yet. I don't know what's going on. When Reuben returned to the pit, so Reuben went off somewhere, we don't know where. He sees Joseph's not there. He tears his clothes. He returned to his brothers and said, the boy is gone, and where can I turn? And they took Joseph's robe, slaughtered a goat, dipped the robe in blood, and had the long robe with sleeves taken to their father. And they said, this we have found. We now whether it is your son's robe or not. They know whose robe it is. He recognized it and said, it is my son's robe. A wild animal has devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. Then Jacob tore his garments, put sackcloth on his loins, and mourned for his son many days. And all his sons and all his daughters sought to comfort him, but he refused to be comforted and said, no, I shall go down to Sheol to my son mourning. Thus his father bewailed him. Meanwhile, the Midianites had sold him into Egypt to Potiphar, one of Pharaoh's officials, the captain of the guard. So we begin the story of Joseph being taken, thrown, sold, now in Egypt. And some questions come up, at least as I'm reading this story. One, Reuben. Reuben had the idea to save his brother. He comes back and his brother has been sold into slavery. What does Reuben not do? He doesn't grab the money and race after the Midianites to buy his brother back, does he? He doesn't go home and to tell his father what has happened, does he? As good as his intentions might have been, they were just intentions. He's just as complicit as the rest of his brothers. Two, his brothers know from being around their father what God has been doing and working in their lives. They know these promises to which they are living out. What do they actively do? Because of their hate for their brother, they actively jeopardize God's future. Okay? So when we read this story, God is not necessarily a character specifically in these verses. But we, as the audience who has read Genesis already, know that God is actively there. And the question is going to be, what is God going to do? How, if we'd never read Genesis before, if you didn't know this story, the question is going to be, how is God going to fulfill His promises to these people? Now that one of the brothers is a slave in Egypt. The other question we would have is, if we are Joseph, what would be in our heart? I want you to just picture you're Joseph, you're a young lad, your whole future's ahead of you. And in one day, your brothers betray you, they sell you into slavery. And now you're in Egypt, and you're working as a slave to somebody you do not know and is not your father. What do you think Joseph feels? How would you feel? Huh? Forsaken? One of the things, I've been reading a lot, and I gave one story in our sermon yesterday, the story of Natalia and her father. But there's a website that you can go to, and it's called the Forgiveness Project. And on that website, you can read dozens of true stories of people that have suffered some of the things we can't imagine. I mean, there are parents whose child has been murdered, and they go to seek to meet the person who's killed their child. Sometimes it was a boyfriend, sometimes it was a stranger. For some of them, it was their child died in a terrorist attack. For some, it was they were the person that had done something bad and they sought forgiveness from the other person. But these are stories that, any of us would live through, would struggle to do what they've done. And they're honest about it. They're honest about how hard it is to forgive people. And reading those stories, I kept thinking about this story because in each of those stories, they're honest about when it happened. Their first desire in their heart, no matter if they were a Christian or not a Christian, was for revenge. And many would say they spent most of their time entertaining fantasies of revenge. And let's just be honest, when people hurt us, do we not do the same thing? Is there anybody in here that's not had, whether it was when you were a child or even as an adult? And it may not be when somebody's hurt you, they've hurt somebody you've loved. You get those images in your mind of what you would do if you could get alone with them. Yeah. There's not one of us that don't do it. And we cannot not imagine Joseph being that way. So Joseph is in Pharaoh's court, And if you continue to read the story in chapter 39 is where it picks up. We read the story of Judah and Tamar, and what we didn't do the last time we read it, if you go and read 38 and 39, you see the difference between Judah and Joseph, where Judah does the wrong thing and tries to cover it up. Joseph does the right thing and still pays for it. He's a person of integrity. So when our first story of Joseph outside of his family unit, we see what kind of man he is. He's second in charge to Potiphar in his house, much as we'll see him in Pharaoh's house. And he does everything well. And Potiphar's wife looks at him. We can only imagine, for one reason or another, she thinks she has control over whatever she wants. Her appetites have been, she wants him. And he refuses. And he knows if he refuses, he's still going to be in trouble. And that's part of the integrity part. He does the right thing even knowing it's going to make his life harder. And he gets thrown into prison. We can just imagine Joseph getting thrown into prison, and not only is he angry about this, but angry about the situation. I mean, what day does he not wake up and think about his brothers? What day would you not wake up? What day would you not wake up and think, why hasn't my father come to look for me? So we read the story and we get farther in the story and we read Joseph in prison and he's able to interpret 2 dreams. And one of those dreams, the person's able to go back and work for Pharaoh and he forgets him. And we can imagine being stuck in prison. It doesn't matter if it's a nice prison or a bad prison. Nobody remembers me. You think about being forgotten. How many times in your life since you've been abandoned by your brothers do you feel like you've been forgotten? Yet through all of it, God is working. And this is the thing about the end of the story. Through all of the bad that happened to Joseph and through Joseph, God works for good. It isn't necessarily Joseph is actively trying to fix the problem that his brothers have made. It is that God uses him because he's willing to get things back to where they need to be. In spite of what's happened, God still works. And for us, in spite of what happens to us and what we do to others, God is still working in our lives for good. So famine hits the land. Before it does, Joseph is able to interpret Pharaoh's dream. 7 years famine. After 7 good years of harvest, he puts Joseph in charge of making sure that everything works out. They store as much as they can. And one of the things you'll notice about this story is that this story sets up the book of Exodus. And even though Joseph is working to make sure that everybody has food, what you'll read within the story, even though Joseph is not an Egyptian, there is something a little shady about what he's doing. In that, starving people show up and he's making money off of them. I mean, they're not buying it at cost. One of the things you'll notice is because of somebody else's suffering, Egypt sets up for the next story. Egypt is making money on their suffering. So that's just kind of in the background. So Joseph is not necessarily, he's kind of, when we read the story of Daniel, Daniel doesn't stop all the bad things happening, does he? So people are coming to Egypt from far and wide to buy food. And they get there, and Joseph's father tells his sons, you've got to go and to buy food. So they go. Now Joseph, this is chapter 42, verses 6 and following. Now Joseph was governor over the land. He's got power. He's got real power now. He's essentially second in charge to Pharaoh, and as being in power, guess what power gives you? The ability over life and death. So Joseph was governor over all the land, and it was he who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed themselves before him, and their faces to the ground. When Joseph saw his brothers, he recognized them, but he treated them like strangers and spoke harshly to them. "Where did you come from?" he said. They said, "From the land of Canaan to buy food." Although Joseph had recognized his brothers, they did not recognize him. Joseph also remembered the dreams that he had dreamed about them. He said to them, "You are spies. You have come to seek the nakedness of the land." They said to him, "No, my lord, your servant have come to buy food. We are all sons of one man. We are honest men. Your servants have never been spies." But he said to them, "No, you have come to see the nakedness of the land." And they said, "We are servants. We are 12 brothers, the sons of a certain man in the land of Canaan. The youngest, however, is now with our father, and one is no more." But Joseph said to them, "It is just as I have said to you, you are spies. Here is how you shall be tested as Pharaoh lives. You shall not leave this place unless your youngest brother is here." So he begins a process of deception on his brothers. And as the audience, we don't know where this is going to go. If we're reading this for the first time, the question we have is, what's his motivation? I mentioned this yesterday, and I said, what does this kind of story remind you of? And one person said, the Count of Monte Cristo. Y'all remember the Count of Monte Cristo? So the Count of Monte Cristo, it starts off these two guys, they are friends, they're like brothers, and one eventually betrays the other, and he's sent off to prison. He eventually escapes, and through a series of adventures, he makes a fortune for himself and becomes the Count of Monte Cristo. And he comes as somebody in much more power than the other guy, who ends up marrying the woman that this guy was engaged to and loved. And he shows up the whole time seeking revenge. It's a whole story about how revenge can make us the opposite of who we were to begin with. It's a very good book. This is a story, we don't know where Joseph's going to go with this. And he makes a deception. He says, "I need you to bring your younger brother." Now, in their minds, what are they thinking? We done killed our dad once. We can't do it again. If we bring Benjamin here, he's liable to get killed. Joseph put some stuff in their packs that they didn't need and sends them back. And all the while, Joseph is emotional. He weeps off and on throughout this story. One wonders why he weeps. Is he overcome with emotion because of his love for his brothers or for hate? We're not given inward motivations of these characters. Sometimes this helps us because we can begin to see ourselves within the story. They end up having more in their packs than they were supposed to. They get back and they think, who has done this to us? Is God getting us back for what we've done to our brother? Or is something else happening? So they go back. Eventually, we get to the point where they bring Benjamin to Joseph. If you read the story, there's some cycles there. And Joseph stands in the place of his forebears as being a trickster, as concealing his identity. But it also is a story of taking his brothers and in many ways letting them feel what he felt like. Helpless, anxious, not knowing what was going to happen to them. He puts them through emotional and psychological torture. Let's just be honest. And we wonder, when is he going to what? Let the axe fall. Chapter 45. They have essentially done what Joseph has asked. Then Joseph could no longer control himself. For all those who stood by him and cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer, so dismayed they were at his presence. Can you imagine being in that room and his brothers realizing who he is? This man has put them through hell. He's had literal power over their lives. And they've been wondering the whole time, why is this happening? And they realize this man, with all this power and all this authority, is our brother whom we sold. If you want to see somebody turn white, they probably turned white. And it wasn't out of happy tears. What's he going to do? Why is he crying? Are those tears of joy or tears of anger? And then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." You can look and see all them brothers standing side by side, seeing who's going to step forward first. "I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing or harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth, and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me father to Pharaoh, and lord of all of his house, and ruler over the land of Egypt. Hurry, go up to my father and say to him, 'Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord over all of Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen. You shall be near me, and your children and your children's children, as well as flocks, your herds, and all that you have. I will provide you for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must go tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt, and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here.' And he fell upon brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all of his brothers and wept upon them. And after that his brothers talked with him." So Joseph responds to them in a way that is unlike the other stories in the book of Genesis. In this story, we see a brother who stands at the door. And rather than seeking revenge, rather than making his brothers feel worse than they probably already do, he invites them to a future with him in this land of abundance. He says, you did for bad, God did for good. He understands the narrative of his life has been reframed. refrain from seeing it as a tragedy of what my brothers did to me versus how did God work through this tragedy for the good not only of me and them, but of everybody. Now in a minute, we're going to compare and contrast the Joseph story and Jesus. And already embedded within the Joseph story are some similarities that we'll hear in Jesus' story. But the question for the brothers is, does Joseph really mean this? I mean, how many of you have ever had to get forgiveness from somebody, or you given forgiveness from somebody, and either you have thought or they have thought of you, did they really mean it? Will they change their mind? And the brothers thinking, does Joseph really mean this forever? What if something changes in this family dynamic that could set him off? What if our father dies? What if the restraint is that he does not want his father to feel the way he felt about himself? That's why he's holding back. So we get to the end of Genesis chapter 50. Jacob, Israel dies. And it's a story where Jacob and Joseph have time together in those last years. And Jacob will bless his two sons. And after he dies, he's buried. And his brothers and them come back. And in verse 15, realizing their father was dead, Joseph's brother says, what if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrong that we did to him? There's still that lingering doubt. There's still that question, is the future going to be for good or for bad? A lot of us live in those kind of moments where we don't know if forgiveness is going to stick. So they approached Joseph saying, and we can only imagine Joseph here. If Joseph had truly forgiven them, is this a surprise to him? Does it hurt his feelings that they come and ask? Or does he sense pity in them for carrying this guilt and shame around for so long? But they come to him and they say, I beg you, forgive the crime. They approach Joseph and say, your father gave this instruction before he died. The question is, did he? We'll just go ahead and assume he did, just for sake. But even if he did, that means what? Jacob questioned. Jacob died not knowing if God's what? Promised future would be intact. I beg you, forgive the crimes of your brother and the wrong they did in harming you. Now therefore, please forgive the crime of your servants of the God of your father. Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Joseph weeps a lot within the narrative. He's overcome with emotion. Then his brothers also wept. They fell down before him and said, we are here as your slaves. All of Joseph's dreams have come true. But Joseph said to them, do not be afraid. Now that's interesting how he phrases that. That's a phrase you'll hear throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament, and it's usually out of the mouth of someone representing God. Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? Yes and no. Yes, in that, as Pharaoh's second in charge, you're over life and death. No, in that true forgiveness and judgment and mercy and grace do not belong to Joseph. And maybe what they really need is forgiveness from God as much as they need it from Joseph. Because Joseph cannot take their doubt away, or their shame away, or their guilt away. Joseph can't do it. You can't do it for other people. When people ask you to forgive them, you can forgive them, but you're not God. You can't make everything in their lives whole again. You can't make new again. You can only forgive. So he recognizes his own limitations in working in their lives in forgiveness. Even though you intended to do harm for me, God intended it for good in order to preserve a numerous people as He is doing today. So have no fear. For I myself will provide for you and your little ones. In this way he reassured them, speaking kindly to them. Joseph does what other brothers cannot do in the narrative of Genesis. He will become his brothers' keepers. Cain denied he had any responsibility over his brothers. Isaac and Ishmael leave parting ways. Jacob and Esau come to a semi-resolution, but they can't even be in a relationship with each other. Joseph will say, even though they did 100 times worse than the others, I will love them and care for them, and I will be their keeper. So I want you to see how in this whole story of Genesis, that we begin with a fractured family because of sin, generational sin. It starts with Adam and Eve. It continues into what? Cain and Abel. It continues into the whole world. And then in the families of even the people God chose to work to make a nation, the Hebrew nation, the Israelites. God chose people that are not perfect. And we see a family that is not even remembered as perfect. How easy would it have been to whitewash Genesis? Some later editor could have come to the text and just changed the story and made everybody perfect. Well, guess what? That doesn't look like real life, does it? This looks like real life, because it is real life. And the question is, how will we see this story and live it out? Will we say to God and to others, we're not responsible for our brothers or our sisters. Their lives are their lives. Even if we've hurt them. Or will we be like Joseph, even when we are harmed by those in our families, that we can move past that harm for the greater good of the whole family and of the world? Will forgiveness allow us to continue to partner with God to live out God's future in the world? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph have the possibility to stop God's promise. They jeopardize it all the time. Over and over, they jeopardize it. Abraham jeopardizes it when he tells Pharaoh that his wife is his sister. Twice. Not once, twice. They jeopardize it by trying to have a child that is not the promised. Even jeopardize it when God tells him to. Go and sacrifice Isaac. Isaac jeopardizes it by not having the wherewithal to go out and find his own wife. It's always in jeopardy. Yet God works through this family, even in the bad they do, for the good, not of just of the family, but of the whole world. So we come back to the story of Israel, Joseph's family. And we read the story of Jesus. And in the story of Jesus, if you read whether it's Mark, Luke, Matthew, or John, you see a favored son. This is my son in whom I'm well pleased. You see a son who is doing his father's will, and some people, brothers of faith, don't always like it. Not only that, but Jesus tells them things they don't want to hear. One day you'll see me coming in clouds. I'll be sitting at the right hand of the Father. Jesus goes to the temple and causes a disturbance. Jesus calls out the hypocrisy of the Pharisees. Jesus is telling people things they don't want to hear. But these aren't strangers. These are people that are like brothers. And what do? They come in the middle of the night. One of his brothers, his disciples, sell him for silver. He's not thrown into a pit, but he's thrown onto a cross. He's stripped of his clothes. And he's murdered. Yet what does God do with this great evil that has happened to him? Resurrection, new life, and salvation. Not just for Israel, but for the whole world. So when we read the story of Genesis, we see a story of God working in the world, not just for the Israelites, but for the whole world. And when we read the story of Jesus, it is that story on a magnitude universal. And Joseph becomes, in many ways, a prototype character in Genesis, a prototype person that will give us an understanding of Jesus later. I can only imagine the writers of Matthew, Luke, and John going back to the story of Joseph over and over again and saying, gracious, there's so many similarities. Yet God has done something bigger and grander. He's taken the evil in the world of brothers and made something beautiful out of it, salvation. So the book of Genesis is a story of brothers and family. We live in families. And all of the story of God depicted in these is it only works. God's future only works if we can live in relationship with God and others the way that God does. And forgiveness is one of the essential things of a life of faith. Because without forgiveness, all the hurts and all the wounds and all the pain and all the sin keep us in the past. And they never let us go into the future. If Joseph couldn't got past what happened to him, there would be no future. If in our lives we can't get past some of those things, and some of them are horrible things that happen to us in our lives, and we didn't ask for them and we didn't deserve them. But if we get stuck in them, do we allow God's future for our lives to be created? And do we live into God's future God has for us out of it? And that's a question each of us have to deal with in our spiritual walk and journey with God. But the book of Genesis and other stories give us permission to ask those hard questions and to see that it can be done. But it's not easy. Let me pray for us if y'all have any comments, questions. Holy God, we thank you for being with us today. We thank you that you often help us to hear and to see things that we've experienced before in new ways. Lord, we're thankful for your word and for how each time we come to it, your Spirit speaks to us in new ways and deeper ways, that we can not only be hearers but be transformed to be doers. Lord, each of us struggle with forgiveness. But the more we practice it in our lives, it goes from being unnatural to natural. But it's still not easy. Help us in our areas of our lives where we struggle to forgive or to be forgiven. Help us, Lord, when sometimes our minds and our hearts get stuck in the pain of the past. And help us to re-center our lives towards the promised future you have. Lord, help us in our lives to love those in our families that are struggling with issues of forgiveness. Let us be good examples of what it means to model your Son in and amongst those we love the most. And Lord, help us to acknowledge in our own lives areas where we need to seek forgiveness or be forgiven by others. Lord, continue to guide and to direct our lives. Continue to show us as a church where you are leading. We pray this in Christ's name. Amen.